My name is Brandon, and this is an FTEC-1, a semi-automatic mag-and-handle half-dart springer designed by Foam Technician. Also note that I will be calling it the FTEC-1 and not the FTEC because even though the name is in all caps like an acronym, I'm pretty sure it's just short for Foam Technician. So Foam Technician, Foam Tech, FTEC, FTEC-1. That's what I'm calling it. Deal with it. Regardless of how you pronounce it, lots of people seem to be curious about this blaster, so today I'm going to cover the 6 things I think you should know about it, and it's going to be a bit of a long one. My name is Brandon, and I first quickly want to make a brief statement/announcement. I really enjoy this hobby, and specifically the gameplay aspects of it, which is why I make the content that I do. And on paper, there's no reason why this hobby cannot be every bit as successful or mainstream as something like paintball or airsoft or any other shooting type sport. I genuinely believe that it can be. My dream is that one day I will be able to walk down the street and see blaster hobby shops on the corner, and that I will be able to go to a park and see kids enrolled in dart tag just like they would enroll in Little League or any other sport. So I'm going to keep doing this because this is important to me. And if that's also important to you and you like what I'm doing and want to support me, I have recently launched a Patreon. Like I said, I'm going to do this either way. However, with your direct support, I can produce content more frequently and purchase the hardware kits required to create build guides more frequently, which in turn allows me to reach a larger audience and drive more traffic to the hobby, hopefully. In return for your support, I'll be providing sneak peeks at all of my builds as I work through them, as well as behind the scenes content with the channel and my workshop and all kinds of other projects that I'm working on. I'll also be holding monthly Q&A live streams, as well as featuring my supporters' names in my videos. So if that's something that interests you, I will have the link to my Patreon in the description box down below, so you can check it out. And if not, the fact that you're even watching this video is more than enough support. I am extremely grateful for every view, comment, and like that I receive, so thank you. Now with that out of the way, we can get back to this. Now, some of the things that I'm going to point out are going to sound like criticisms, but they're not necessarily things that are negative. They're just things that I think are prominent enough that if those things are important to you, they will likely influence your decision about whether or not you pick this up, which is kind of the whole way that I review blasters. I just tell you things that I think are important about this thing, and you can come to your own conclusions. But right off the bat, the first thing that you need to know about this blaster is that it is absolutely a high performance blaster. It's not the strongest blaster out there by any means. However, the overall way that it's just constructed and the ease at which it can be built and maintained for the level of performance that it offers is notable. The plunger tube for the FTEC is right here above the grip, and when you prime the blaster, you're actually sliding the whole plunger assembly forward into the plunger, which compresses the spring and catches the plunger on the plunger assembly thing. It moves the whole thing forward, squeezes everything together. This also slides this pusher back and allows a dart to slide up. Then when you complete the prime, you're sliding the whole plunger assembly forward, so the plunger is now like right here-ish. And because you've pulled the pusher forward, you've now chambered a dart into the barrel. So now once you pull the trigger, you are actually releasing that plunger, which compresses the air and basically forces it up a little U-bend right here behind the dart and out through the barrel. So it's essentially the same way that like a Lynx is set up, because this mechanism is just becoming a lot more common in blasters because it's an easy way to save space. But every little moving component along this path of air has very well-sized O or X rings and just has a great seal without very much effort, just all the way through. In addition to having a tight seal, this barrel is actually 2 pieces of brass nested inside of each other to create a super snug fit that the dart honestly can barely fit into. The inner barrel is actually a little bit shorter than the outer barrel, so one end of this barrel assembly actually has like a slight indent, which I believe might function as a sort of porting to allow some of the air out before it gets to the end of the barrel. However, if you flip it around and put the opening side towards the magazine, it basically creates a small funnel that helps guide the dart in, which can be really useful if you have darts that jam in this kind of barrel. However, according to Foam Technician, if you do that, you should be expecting to lose about 10 FPS. I believe because you're making the seal just kind of generally weaker back here because the barrel's now wider where the pusher tries to seal everything. So even though this is a blaster with a smaller form factor and the plunger tube is actually relatively small in terms of its volume, the overall efficiency here allows it to have the same performance as a much larger primary blaster. I have the 13 kilogram spring in mind, which is the middle level offering that's supposed to get you about 200 FPS. And even though I am running a SCAR barrel that is fairly tight and my barrel is in the suboptimal position with the funneling down here, I'm still getting about 181 FPS on average of the advertised 200. So for me, that's substantial considering I've put no effort into improving the seals or anything. The 8 kilogram spring is rated at about 150 FPS, and the 18 kilogram spring is rated at about 220 FPS if you just hate having working arms. Now the second thing that I think you should know about this blaster is that it's basically a brick. Even at 20% infill, this thing weighs 3.2 pounds, which is a lot considering it's basically an oversized sidearm. Jumping back to the priming mechanism, it's basically a full-size blaster wrapped under itself and then encased in a giant plastic block, so it makes sense, and in some ways it's nice because this blaster has no flex at all, which is a very common complaint that I hear about 3D printed blasters, that they feel a little rickety or wobbly or wonky when you compare them to something out of the box from NERF or Dart Zone. But that rigidity and stability comes at a cost, which is that it's heavy. And I know that 3.2 pounds isn't an insane amount of weight. However, the majority of that weight is right here in front of and above the trigger, which means when you're holding it, all of the weight is in front of your wrist, so it always wants to pull down like this. Conversely, the stock is super light, and this back here is actually completely hollow because the pusher slides into that. So basically, all of the blaster is on this side. And this is a bit of an issue for me because I have a wrist injury, and it's difficult for me to hold this with one hand for a long period of time without it hurting me. For me to use it comfortably, I always have to keep my hand on the priming grip while I'm using the blaster, which is obviously you need to anyways because it's a spring-powered blaster that I have to prime every time, but there's still moments when I need to take my hand off of this. For example, this magazine release, this little nub down here, I can't operate with my primary hand. I have to hit it with my offhand, which means now I'm putting all the weight of the blaster on this arm, which is why I'm stabilizing it on my shoulder like this. Now this is something that I could mitigate with a sling easily. However, the FTEC does not have any sling attachment points, except for maybe these rails. However, as I'll get to, these collapse, so you don't really want to put anything on them. And even if I did, they would slide around. So I'm probably going to have to 3D print some sling attachment points, but there's no rails in the back, so it is small enough that I could probably run it on a single point sling pretty easily and just kind of keep it tucked down, but we'll have to see. But since I touched on it, the third thing that I want to talk about is this collapsible stock, which is super cool, smooth, well-designed, and I can't stand it at all. Basically, this little stock block down here has a T-shaped piece of plastic that's under pressure by two springs, which is constantly forcing it up into these rails. That way it pushes into these little notches down here. And when you pull this little latch, it basically acts as a lever that pulls the T-shaped thing down and out of the little notch so that you can slide the stock forward or backwards. See how easy that was? I did not expect this to work as smoothly as it does. I thought there would be just a lot more friction. I thought the T-shaped thing would require a lot of sanding and fine tuning to actually get it to slide into these notches quickly and not require me to kind of wiggle it until it lines up or something like that. But it actually just works perfectly like every time. But that means that basically the entire stock is a metal bar. So there's no way for me to comfortably get a cheek weld here because there's just no surface for me to put my head on. And even if I don't do a full cheek weld, this always pushes into my neck, which is just very uncomfortable when you're trying to look down the sights. I actually used a metal file to kind of soften all of these edges on the top of the stock because it was actually like digging into my neck a little bit when I was testing the blaster. And this wouldn't be as much of an issue if it was a hip fire-ish blaster or a blaster that you're just going to keep it low ready and just quickly bring up for the occasional shot without necessarily lining up your sights. However, this is a powerful blaster that is very accurate, so I want to actually aim it and take my time and hit the target that I'm aiming at, which means I need to look down my sights and make sure that my sight picture is good, which means I need to get a cheek weld, which means I have to touch my face to this bar. I'm sure with enough practice I could find a place to keep my head that doesn't rely on me actually physically touching the stock. However, that requires a lot of repetition, and that would require me to use this blaster probably more than my other blasters, so I don't know if I'll ever really get to that point. I could also put some sort of foam covering or something on this, but then I couldn't collapse the stock, so it would kind of defeat the point. Additionally, and this is actually kind of a criticism of the design, there's only 2 notches. It's extended and closed. So I'm lucky in that this stock length is basically perfect for me in terms of its length. It's actually maybe a tiny bit too long. However, if you're smaller than me at all, then this is probably too long for you, and you can't actually make it shorter without cutting new notches into this or actually shortening the bars and drilling new holes for the stock. The fourth thing that I want to talk about is magazine compatibility, because this is a Talon-only blaster that is designed to use the standard 15-round straight mags or the 18-round curved mags, which is great if you have official Talon magazines. But if you use printed mags, many of them don't fit. The magwell has very specific cutouts at the top and the bottom for the little square edges of the Talon, and these hybrid geometry mags have one squared off side and one sort of tapered angled side, and they're also a tiny bit wider. And after a lot of sanding, it goes in, but there's just a lot of friction, and it doesn't work smoothly, which granted, if you continuously sand it and sand it and sand it, eventually it'll work better, but all of the other 3D printed mags that I tested all kind of have the same issue where they're just sort of jutting into the geometry in weird places because they're just not shaped the same way that Talon is. Also, because the barrel is basically above the whole plunger assembly, it's higher than usual, which means that this 12-round mag actually doesn't fit. It's too short. You basically can't get it out of the magwell, or you can't insert it all the way. So you need to make sure if you do use 3D printed mags that they are at least 13, 14, 15 rounds so that enough protrudes that you can actually get them back out. The fifth thing that I think you should know about the FTEC-1 is that it's a very involved build. There's nothing inherently difficult or complex about it. There's nothing you can really mess up. However, there's just a lot of parts that are screwed together with many, many, many screws, like so many screws. It is worse than a Griffin. There are also numerous O and X rings that need to be lubricated and other high friction areas that need to be lubricated in order for the blaster to run properly, which involves a little bit of trial and error and kind of breaking the blaster in. I've taken this blaster apart 3 times, and I never want to do it again because there are just so many screws. It takes so long to undo all of these screws. For the Picatinny rails alone, there are 27 screws. 27 screws for 3 rails, 2 of which are short. My hand actually locked up a few times while I was building this, and I had to take a break because I just couldn't keep turning anymore. I had to switch hands, and it was bad. There's just a lot of screws, all right? There's a lot of screws. It's also worth noting that a few of the screw holes are quite deep, and screwdrivers like this actually physically can't fit down deep enough to turn the screw. So I had to get one of these super long boys to actually get in there and do that. So be aware that you need a screwdriver that's at least maybe 4 inches long. That said, Foam Technician actually provides an assembly video that's like 40 minutes long and is very in-depth and involved, and he talks through every step of the process, and you should definitely watch it at least once or twice before you start building this, just to make sure you know where everything goes, and maybe even watch it once if you're just thinking about picking one up so you can kind of see how it all works and what's involved. And that brings us to the last thing that I think you should know, and as always, that is, where do you get one? Which is an easy thing to answer because nobody sells these pre-built that I'm aware of. Foam Technician sells the hardware kits as well as selling the digital files that you need to purchase in order to print the blaster yourself. And it is worth noting that This is not an inexpensive blaster, and this is where I'm going to lose some of you. The hardware kit for the FTEC-1 is about $60, which is comparable to hardware kits for something like a Caliburn or a Talon Claw, or even the Lynx. And obviously it includes all the hardware that you need, but it also has them organized into little numbered bags, and it has a bill of materials and includes duplicates of all the O-rings and like double the screws that you actually need just in case you break some, which I did just by screwing them in. I just snapped the heads off at least 2 screws. I don't know how widespread of an issue that is and whether or not all kits kind of have weak screws or if it's just the batch or supplier for the time that I got my kit, but it's good that it came with extras because I broke them. And when you consider the primary spring as well as the properly sized smaller springs to make sure that things like the stock work smoothly, plus the 4 aluminum bars that make the stock and priming work, and the custom brass barrel, $60 is a totally reasonable price point for the hardware. However, the STL files that you need to actually print the blaster are being sold for about $30, which has been a sticking point for some people because it brings the minimum cost of this blaster up from $60 to $90. And that's before you even factor in the cost of the 3D printed parts in terms of time and materials. While more and more designers have been charging in the $5 to $15 range for their files, a majority of the blasters historically and currently are still free, and I think that the jump from $5–10 up to 30 is just a lot for people to adjust to. The only blaster that has a similar fee is, I believe, the Hummingbird, which is, I think it might be $35 actually for the Hummingbird, but the Hummingbird is expensive to build, so that makes sense. The FTEC-1 is a very well-designed blaster that delivers exactly what it promises. It's super rigid, performs well out of the box with minimal effort, and it's just a really solid offering overall. However, it doesn't really do anything that you can't get from another blaster beyond the aesthetics. So if that licensing fee is too high for you and puts it above your price point, you're going to be just as happy getting a well-made Talon Claw. That said, the various creators in our hobby absolutely have the right to charge for their work, and they should. Each of these blasters is designed by a person who spent hours and hours designing and prototyping and testing and building these blasters. And their time, effort, and ingenuity is absolutely worth something. They should be compensated. It's also worth noting that in that $30 licensing fee is a clause that allows you to sell 1 copy of the blaster per license that you purchase. So if you don't have the means to print one yourself, you can absolutely buy the files and license somebody to build one for you. There's also a clause that allows you to build as many of these as you want, as long as you aren't charging people or they're only paying for the actual materials required to build it. There are also files in a hardware kit for this FTEC-1 specific scar barrel, which each sell for about $5 or $15 if you want one printed and assembled. I had a lot of trouble keeping the tension on mine, so it didn't perform very well. Therefore, I can't really judge it because I ended up just throwing a turbine on instead. But if you're interested, I will have links down below for the scar as well as the hardware kit and files for the actual FTEC-1. Obviously. Overall, I really like this blaster. It doesn't feel like any other blaster that I own, which is nice because when blasters feel really similar, it's harder to justify one over the other. And I'm very happy with the overall performance and the priming weight. The biggest concern for me is the weight, because when I got this blaster, my intent was to have a Springer primary that I could operate with one hand when I'm playing games like Flux or Capture the Flag or anything that involves using my left hand for something else. However, if the weight becomes an issue and I can't actually do that, then it doesn't fulfill that purpose, and then I don't know. So we'll have to see. I am happy with the size of it. However, even with the stock collapse, it's a little longer than I thought it was going to be. Granted, some of that is because of my scar, but I still thought this might be like 2 or 3 inches shorter than it was. It's much bigger than I expected. I'm also very glad that it operates well and smoothly because I never want to take this back apart ever again, so hopefully it never breaks or jams in any way that involves me having to fix something inside, because I might just not. There don't seem to be a ton of people who have an FTEC-1, but if you do, I would love to hear your experiences and thoughts on the blaster. And if you're somebody who wants one or somebody who adamantly doesn't want one, I would really love to hear your reasons for either in the comments down below. I hope that you found this video helpful, and if you did, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe for more content like this in the future. And I'm tired of talking, so thank you for watching. I will see you next week.